Hi, I'm Lenina Rassool, your host on Mental Health Matters, where every week we sit down with a mental health expert to discuss all things mental health and more. And today we are speaking about intergenerational trauma. Now, we already know that we can inherit certain things from our parents. This could be diabetes or high blood pressure or behaviors like addiction and alcoholism. If you have had cancer in your family, there is a chance that you might have a higher likelihood of contracting it now. But new research is emerging that another thing we can inherit from our ancestors is trauma. After the break, we're going to be speaking to Judith Kennedy from InsideOut NPO, who facilitates healing circles in communities for us to talk about trauma as well as intergenerational trauma. And we're going to look at what that is and how we can start healing something that happened before we were born, but that still affects our behavior today. But before we have that conversation, we are going to play a short video about trauma and healing. Let's have a look.
My name is Judith Kennedy. I am the director for InsideOut. InsideOut is an organization that was formed in 2019 as a response to the current situations in our communities. We work with various communities, both urban and rural. We work with young people, with women, with men, with young boys. We work with activists and people on the forefront of struggles in our communities. Our approach is a community-based approach. It's born in the communities where we come from. It's developed in the communities where we come from, and we're trying to bring back a way of working that has been lost to us, and that is by working with people from where they are at. And trying to help people or to facilitate processes and spaces where people feel free and safe to talk about issues that affects them on a daily basis. And I'm not just talking about the effects of our current situation and the current social ills that we're facing, but also issues of generational trauma and violence that people have been facing. And so how do we facilitate spaces and processes where people can start dealing with those things in order for us to create a better society at large. For us, it's important to acknowledge where people are at, and also to kind of incorporate the learnings of everybody has their own learnings and bring their own issues and knowledge and concerns and challenges. Everybody brings their own stuff, and so how do we collectively learn it, but also how do we collectively heal as communities? And I think that for us is important, and creating a model for that has become absolutely important, because a lot of the people that we work with, in fact all the people that we work with, are not able to access the kind of professional services that uses different approaches. So we want to, in this clip, show you some of the kinds of methods that we use to get people to start talking. And the method that we're using today is called the life cycle, and this is the basis of the work that InsideOut does.
So here we go. This is a cycle that InsideOut uses when we work with people. It's called the cycles of life.
InsideOut is an organization that was formed in 2019.
And what I really liked about it was about me from inside here. It makes sense of my life very easily. Quickly, 1, 2, 3, and I've made sense of where I am in my my life and what disturbed me and what put me off my path and so on.
Starting off from this tool, when they get home that evening, they might understand it a little bit better. So
Yeah.
the tool is a very powerful instrument, definitely.
Conflict resolution focuses on the conflict, but never ask the question, why are people reacting in the way that they do? To make them so angry that they get to a point where you need conflict resolution. So we're saying in our approach is, let's go to the root.
If we're going to resolve some of the difficulties between people in South Africa, we need ways to heal and talk to each other about what has happened that is straightforward and simple, that I can understand.
Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and we are speaking about generational trauma and intergenerational trauma. And here to help us unpack this topic is Judith Kennedy, who is from the organization Inside Out. Judy, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
So Judy, we know people often talk about sort of cycles, family cycles that repeats itself. We know in the addiction and alcoholism, they say can be inherited. So can chronic disease like diabetes. And now there is narrative around trauma that can be inherited. And it sounds a bit like out there. So can you please explain to us what intergenerational trauma means?
So intergenerational trauma means that traumas that has been experienced by our ancestors can be transferred to us. And that happens through the genes. It happens through, an example of intergenerational trauma could be alcoholism, like you mentioned before. But where does that come from? It comes from slavery, where people were paid through the DOP system and all of those kinds of things. And then what happens is that then gets passed on to younger generations through the genes. Trauma also is about traumatic events. We all know, we've all experienced trauma in our lives, whether we realize it or not. We've all experienced trauma. We've experienced trauma such as slavery, apartheid, colonialism, COVID, but we've also experienced individual traumas such as abuse, such as domestic violence, murders, rapes, divorce, all of those things causes us trauma. But a lot of the times we don't have the words, or we don't have the understanding of what causes trauma, and we just continue as if nothing happened. Yet those traumas changes our behavior. And then that behavior becomes normal behavior that gets passed on to younger generations. But it's actually not normal behavior.
Yeah.
If we look at the levels of violence in our communities today, that's not normal. It can never be normal. The way that we kind of, to a certain degree, lost our humanity. The fact that you can just walk up to someone and ask them something, and if they don't agree, you can just stab them or kill them or rape them or anything like that, and that behavior has become normal. We become so oblivious to it that we say, shame, and we don't actually take the time. If it didn't happen to you, you don't take the time to think about what actually happened for this person, what did this person go through. And then the result of that kind of behaviors then plays out in our society. If we look at communities on the Cape Flats especially, and we look at the kind of gangsterism and the violence that permeates our society, it's all results from traumatic experiences. and traumatic, and a lot of it is because of collective traumatic experiences. So as Inside Out, we say if we're saying that these experiences are collective experiences, and the kind of fruits of those experiences, which are domestic violence, gangsterism, and all of those things, are on the effects of that comes up in our communities where we live, and when we experience that every day, then we need to start talking about how do we collectively heal instead of, or not instead of, one-on-one kind of thing. I think first of all, in our communities, people don't wake up and say, oh, I'm traumatized, I must now go and see a psychologist. Because first of all, we need to figure out what's for supper tonight.
Yeah.
We need to go work, we need to get the kids, we need to do all of those things. So this thing happens to you, and you just move on because you don't have the time to still deal with all of the stuff. But the implications of not dealing with those things can have lasting effects on yourself, on your family, on your kids, on your future generations if we don't address those issues. So there's different levels of trauma. There's what we call systemic trauma, the trauma that the state inflicts on us.
And that's a trauma that's very difficult to see and pinpoint
Yes.
and understand.
But there's a lot of kind of resistance to the state and to the way the state perpetuates the violence on our communities. However, I think there's a disconnect between so we're fighting, we build movements, we do all of these kinds of things to oppose the state, but I think we don't take the time to look at what effect does it have on us as individuals, as an example, in those movements or organizations where we find ourselves that's trying to fight the state. And so at the end of the day, for me, the healing of the trauma starts with the self. Because if we don't deal with our own trauma and we want to form movements to fight against the kind of state violence that we see, our movements because we step into those organizations and to those movements as full people. We don't leave our trauma outside.
Yes.
So we bring it into the organization without us knowing. This is all subconscious, but the way we view things, we view things from our own trauma.
So I want to
Yeah.
I want to come back to that. So there were a couple of things that jumped out. One was behavior, because often we think about trauma and we think about mental health as such an abstract thing.
Yes.
Right. And bringing it down to sort of behavior often gives us like, this is a physical thing that we can sort of address. This is what it looks like. I wanted to ask about normalization. So if we're talking about behavior, we're talking about cycles, we're talking about ongoing, and let's take domestic violence, or let's take violence in communities. It's something we can't crack. It's just ongoing. But we also know that what sort of, I want to say, that keeps it going is that we feel a sense of powerlessness. Like there's nothing we can do. Something's happening next door. I would say, my experience of this was when I was very young, let's say up until 10 years old, there was domestic violence happening in the street and in the home. And it was only after I moved that I realized, oh my word, that's not normal. Because as a child, I'm seeing this violence happening and I'm waking up the next day and nobody's saying anything about it. And so it is sort of this acceptable thing. And so when we think about sort of those inherited behaviors, not just the perpetuation of the violence, but also this feeling of powerlessness, do we, not we let it continue, but it continues because part of it is we feel we can't do anything about it. And is that also, you go to slavery, you can do anything about slavery. We were just oppressed. And if you do something, you could be killed and die.
I mean, that still happens today.
Yeah.
So yes, I think the short answer is yes. As young children, we learn from the behavior of adults, whether it is adults in our homes or adults in our community. And if those behaviors of the adults, the negative behaviors of adults doesn't get addressed, or if it's not challenged and it's just left, we think that that's okay. And we think that that's how it's supposed to be, and that is how we grow up because we saw. But my mother didn't stop my father when, or say anything. She just accepted the domestic violence. She just accepted the abuse. And so that's probably how it's supposed to be. And like you say, then when you move out, your world gets bigger, you start realizing, but actually, this is not normal. This is not how it's supposed to be. And the sad part is that those bad behaviors have become so normal. So the abnormal becomes normal. And it's difficult to change that on that kind of level. We can only start changing that once we start working on ourselves and our own behavior and becoming aware of what the things are that triggers us, and where that comes from. And that's how we start changing that behavior. It's a long process.
Yes, and often people don't want to change. Sometimes if you are what they call, they have this great term now called a cycle breaker. Often a cycle breaker, there was just one person in the family and everybody else is sort of, they're not happy with the behavior. They understand something's wrong. It's disrupting the family system, but they are resistant to change.
I think that's got a lot to do with fear. Fear of facing your own reality, of your own traumas, acknowledging that actually I've also gone through something that I must now talk about, I must now open up about all of these things. And so if you're a cycle breaker, you're actually a very courageous person because you're prepared to face yourself and face your own fears and face your own trauma, because that's the only way we're going to start dealing with, is acknowledging it and then trying to work through that. But I think the other thing is also about facing your trauma is also recognizing what are the things that and the behaviors that triggers you to, and then interrogating that. Like, what is the things, why do you get so mad when this person walks into the room? Or why do you get so mad when your partner starts drinking? Or why do you get so mad, when there's loud noises, or when there's gang violence, or when there's all of those things?
I'm fascinated by triggers. I think in the context of intergenerational trauma, when I think about something sort of being passed on, could there be triggers that from things that you haven't directly experienced? Is that also, like, when you're talking about these responses, like, why is this bothering me so much? And you can't understand it because you can't sort of link it to your own experience. Is that part of it?
That is definitely part of the kind of intergenerational transfer of trauma, because you might not have experienced something to feel or be triggered by something. But if you go back into your own history and talk to your parents, your grandparents, you'll find that there's something that has been passed on. So triggers can be anything. It can be a smell, it can be a picture, it can be a sound, it can be a memory, it can be anything really. And you can get triggered by that and you don't know why you're so triggered. That's when you're going to have to go back and say, okay, let's have this conversation. Why do I feel this way? Did something happen? And the key really is to have conversations, especially with our elders, with our grandparents, great-grandparents, our parents, about their own histories in order for us to make sense of why we are the way we are today. And I think that is a big part of starting the healing journey, is to actually hear that stories, if you're still privileged to have those people around, to have those conversations.
So Inside Out has these conversations in communities. You bring people together and you start talking about these things that no one has ever talked about before. How important is it to create a safe space to start talking about? Because often we can't speak about these things in our family. Again, there's a resistance to, I think you said, the baseline is always fear. Fear, you're going to face this trauma now, you're going to admit it happened, and you're going to start talking about it. But
And what are people going
actually,
to think about me?
exactly, and that's so threatening. And I have heard many, many people say, no, we don't talk about those things.
Under the mat.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I want to ask, what is the experience like for people when they come? So speaking to everybody out there who's afraid to sort of verbalize and face these fears, you've sat with people who started talking about it. What is the experience like when people finally find a safe space to be able to express these things?
For us, it's more of a non-judgmental space because safe spaces these days are not always safe. So we have what we call healing circles that happens once a month, and everyone is welcome to attend. Our next one will be in January, and this is a space where you can come and talk about the things that you can't talk to anybody about, or that you don't want to, or that you're afraid to. There's no judgment. We don't determine what the conversation is. People come and you talk if you want to talk. And the space is created for you to share. The space is also created for others to also share, so it's a learning and sharing space. And a lot of the times when we have these conversations, the people in the circles have similar issues, struggling with similar things. First of all, I think the one common thing that draws people also is the fact that they recognize that something is not right inside them and that they need to get it out. So the verbalization of what it is that we're going through is of utmost importance, because that's when we can start embarking on a healing journey. So in the healing circles, you'll also find people who have gone through maybe the similar kind of situation, and people start sharing, how they coped with things. We don't claim to be, we don't claim to have all the tools on intergenerational trauma or on healing or on any of those things. But what we offer is a non-judgmental space. We offer the tools that we have and that we can share, and other people also come and share their own tools. But the result of a lot of those conversations is you can see a visible relief, in people's faces, in people's body languages. Once they've told their story, you can see it's like, whew, this brick is off because it sits here. All that stuff that we don't want to deal with starts sitting here. And you can actually physically see how the relief on people's faces and in their bodies when they shared their stories. I mean, once people make the connections also between, so we do training and workshops on intergenerational trauma, and once people make the connection between their own behavior and they look at behavior of ancestors or elders and those kinds of things, and you see the light bulb moments, that is when people are just like, I didn't know this, I don't believe this, I can change this, because I can change this by changing my behavior. I mean, and what that does, the power that gives the person in the moment is just, it's magical to see.
And also, I think it's probably also about hearing about, we don't often think about behavior as something that can be changed, right? We think it's inherent. Our behavior is who I am. Sometimes people use it as a defense, right?
Yes,
I am just, this is who I am.
My family is like this. We will do this, and that is just who we are.
And you just have to accept it.
Yes, but actually it's behavior that has been learned, behavior that has been passed on from generation to generation, and we don't question our own behavior, or we don't question why do we behave in the way that we do. It's just who we are.
And then I'm thinking about, and I do want us to talk about, when we talk about collective trauma and collective dysfunction, and we say this is just the way my family is, we are not also, because we're stuck in that family, we're stuck in that sort of community, we are not seeing and we're not exposed to alternative types of behavior or healthier
Yes.
types of behavior in terms of an earlier light bulb to say, oh, actually, I don't have to respond in this way. I can do it in that way. What we're seeing often is just, this is the way things are. And as you said, until your world expands, you don't know it can be any
Yes.
different. I'm loving this conversation, but we need to take a short break.
Okay.
We'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters. We are speaking about trauma and intergenerational trauma. And still with me in studio is Judith Kennedy from the organization InsideOut. And Judy, before the break, we were talking about, how trauma sort of manifests, trauma for individuals versus collectives, and looking at how, trauma drives behavior in individuals and also families and also communities, and that people often aren't exposed to sort of alternative, healthier behaviors. I wanted to ask, we are saying part of the answer is talking about it. Part of the answer is acknowledging it. But people, and we know that there's a lot of narrative around shame. People are ashamed of their trauma. I want to ask, do people feel embarrassed? Because I know embarrassment and shame is not the same thing, right? Do people feel like I'm embarrassed that I have these types of issues?
I mean, I can only speak about the people that we've worked with in this kind of space. And I don't think there's an element of, I think there's an element of relief that it's out, but I don't think, some people might, for some people, everyone's journey is different.
Yeah.
And so some people might not speak in the first instance because what will people think if I say this? But once other people start sharing, you find that even those that are reluctant to share, they're in the space, they know this is what it's about,
They've taken
but
the first step.
they've taken the first step, but they're still reluctant to speak. Once they start hearing other people tell their stories,
Yes.
then you can't stop them.
And I think that's what I mean. Like, is there an element initially, they feel embarrassed, they feel, what prevents people from speaking, do you think, about these things?
Shame and guilt, definitely, right? I think that's the two things that causes the most damage. If you look at suicides, if you look at all of those kinds of things, a lot of the time it's shame and guilt. And so yes, people feel also, especially in the healing circles, because it's an open thing, you'll really find people that you know in those spaces. And obviously people think, who are these people? But we try to make sure that everyone is comfortable, everyone feels okay to share, and people can share as much as they want, or as little as they want. But like I say, and then you find the people who says, I don't talk a lot. And then once they start talking, you have to actually say, actually, you know what, there's other people also that needs to talk. So I think once people see that it's okay when others tell their stories, they find the courage in themselves to tell their own stories. And once they find that courage, and sometimes people come once, twice, and only on the third time they speak. And that is fine, because it's not you can't rush anyone's process. People will speak when they're ready to speak. I think the fact that they come to the healing circles is the first step of acknowledgement that something is not right. The space is also for people who can't afford to necessarily go the clinical approach. And that's what the reason why we started this and why we're doing it in communities, is because often in our communities, people don't think about it, people don't, and even if they do realize something has happened to me that I can't deal with, they don't have the access to necessarily go the clinical approach. And so how do we create spaces for people like that to just come and to just let it all out, so that they can find some kind of relief and embark on some kind of journey of healing for themselves.
I want to ask you about this space of, how did you put it, recognizing that something is not right. We started this whole conversation by saying there are so many everyday pressures that we have to do. Physical things like go to work, put food on the table, manage the kids, get them to school, etc. Like all of this stuff. Even if that is like looking for a job or cleaning the household. So there's all of these things. And there is a culture of just, because, people generally don't talk about trauma, historical trauma, which could be family secrets, which could be, things like, you mentioned rape, murder, suicide, etc. All of these things in our histories and the whole history of slavery and what happened there. And let's also say, things that people did themselves that was facilitated by the circumstances that they found themselves in. So we don't talk about it, and we think a measure of health is just getting through the day, finishing all my tasks, getting to nighttime and going to sleep because everybody was fed and everybody made it to school, right? What is that point of recognizing that something is not right? I'm interested in what that often looks like for people, and I don't know if you can draw from some of the things that people said. Is it the buildup of something? Is it the, can it look like a deep depression and somebody's like, this is not right? What does that not right look like when people...
I think it's more of what does that not feel like? What does that feel like?
Yeah.
I mean, in my own experience, because all of us, like I say, all of us suffer through different kinds of traumas. And in my own experience, it was this feeling that I have to do something now in order to change the direction that I'm going in. It's about the thoughts. What are the kinds of thoughts that we're having? Because our thoughts impacts our actions. And so what we think, we feel, we do. And so if our thinking is negative, that makes us feel bad. That makes us feel worthless. That makes us feel guilty. That makes us feel full of shame. And so what am I going to do then? And where does that lead me to? Depression and all the steps in depression. And you end up committing suicide or whatever the case may be, is because we don't make the connection between what we feel, what we think, and what we feel and how we act, how we behave.
Yeah.
And so that interrogation, and the process is so quick in our brains. It's like, and we go through it every day 1,000, 5,000 times, but we don't make the connections we don't take the time to stop and say, okay, why am I thinking this? And how does this make me feel? And what am I doing? And so once we start doing that, you can start dealing with the stuff. But we also find it very selfish, if you can call it that, to spend time on yourself.
Yes.
Because everybody else must be sorted out, like you said earlier. So everybody else must be sorted out, and so you just continue because they must be sorted out, and you forget about yourself, and you forget about how you and your behavior impacts on the rest of the people that's around you, or in your community, or in your family, And so, and then that is the kind of, and then other young people see that in your family, in the community, they see that this is how you get things done, and we adopt those things. And in the meantime, this person is sitting with all this heaviness inside, and all this trauma and all this anger, and the person is sick, and because it sits in your body, and so you start feeling, lazy is not the word, what's the word? Lethargic. You start feeling that you don't want to be around people. You start isolating yourself. You start doing things mechanically because you must get through the tasks. But also all of those tasks and all of those things becomes your defense mechanism. Because now you have all of those things to do, so you're not going to deal with this issue. You don't have time now because everything else needs to happen. And in the meantime, everything festers within you, to a point where you realize, actually, I can't do this anymore. I need to stop, I need to breathe, I need to
But
do something different, you know.
you were saying, like, you mentioned sort of doing the work on self can come across as selfish or even indulgent, but it's also sort of, for many of us, it's a foreign concept. We don't just sit and think or sit and interrogate. It's almost, exactly, it's almost like weird, unless you maybe, you know, writing in a journal or something, but it's almost weird to sit and take that time, and everything else seems much more important than that. So how can we...
especially women.
And especially women. And I also want to say, you know, I often say on the show, we have all these fears of judgment. But the thing we don't often say is that the judgment is often justified. I mean, the fear is often justified because we are actually judged for it. You know, that fear comes from actually people will call you, they will call you selfish. It's not like in the movies where you have the aha moment and the universe sort of conspires and everybody understands and you've shifted. It's not that. People will actually say, why are you just sitting there
And not doing
anything. And not doing anything.
Goodness grief, and you just
Exactly. Or you say, I can't help you with whatever because, you know, this is my time too. And people will just say, but you're not doing anything. Or why are you going to... I even think, you know, if I can almost imagine, like, coming to the healing circle and people will be like, did you speak about the family? Like, what did you say? So there's a lot of judgment, and there is, how can we get to a space where we can, I think almost we can say we can legitimize it, we can prioritize this. Why is it necessary? I also want to, you know, and in the beginning it's also hard to see that there is an other side, that you're going to get to better, that this thing, you said it's a long process. So how do people handle that space, of that judgmental space that does exist?
I think we ourselves are our biggest critics. So we judge ourselves whether we know it or not. No, if I'm going to say this and then this and then no, you know. So the judgment, the self-judgment is a big thing that we need to kind of get through. And I think we need to say it's okay to sit down. It's okay to go to the beach and just sit there. It's okay to go in your room and close your door and just sit and be silent and write and do what. It's okay to take time for you because all your time is spent on everyone else and making sure everyone else is okay. And often that's not returned. And so it's important for, especially women, I think, because I think women wear the brunt of trauma. That it's okay for us to say, no, I can't do this because this is my time and this is what I'm doing. And it's okay to be selfish about it, irrespective of what people think. At the end of the day, it's about our own kind of mental health. It's about looking after ourselves so that we can look after other people better. Because if we don't, and if we don't look after ourselves, if we don't interrogate ourselves, if we don't challenge our own behavior, if we don't, what is it that we're passing along? You know, so we can either be the people that continue with the bad behavior, or we can be the first in our generation. We can be the cycle breaker and do things differently and be the first generation of people to change the way future generations is going to look like. And that's both on a personal level, but also I think on a more systemic level. You know, as an example is also how do we, with all the movements, if we talk about systemic violence and we talk about all of that kinds of stuff, with all the movements, and I mean we've been struggling for years now. We march till we're blue in the face. We do all of these things, which is needed. But how do we start to think differently about how we engage or oppose or challenge the state? Because again, what we think, we feel, we act. And so how do we change our thinking so that we have a different response or a different outcome? And I think we're at a point in the country where we need to start doing things differently.
I want to ask about, and that's so great. I mean, I love that you brought in, you know, changing the way we think, looking at feelings and looking at our response. When we spoke about women, people need to learn to say no. We need to learn to sort of relax. We need to think about sort of our responses. One of the things that, and there's a large narrative around that now, around self-care, around self-wellness. One of the things that often emerges in conversation with people is that, yes, it's fine, we want to prioritize that, but when we do it, we feel, and we feel very intrinsically, very physically that there's something wrong. It feels like what we're doing is wrong. And so what is interesting for me is that when we think about I think, okay, well, my experience of women, both through the narratives, but also probably through, you know, generations, is that they must be constantly busy, and they must serve others, and they must be, and women must not speak out. I have a theory. I have a theory that women are afraid of speaking and afraid of visibility because once upon a time, it was an actual threat to be seen and be heard. You know, you would be killed. You had no rights.
And so this is the trauma response.
Yes, and so so even though now you have the right to do it, but it feels very threatening, right? So it's almost like we're inheriting that adaptation to threat. And is that sort of, you know, what happens? And it's very interesting in terms of apartheid, if we think about it, in terms of a society. And what were our ancestors afraid of? Do we still feel, who were they afraid of? And how do we feel in this day and age when we engage with them?
I think, so I definitely think it's a trauma response to keep on being busy, and you keep on, you know, you just have to be busy all the time. You can't take a moment for yourself. And I think a lot of that comes from, like you say, in the slavery, who were we afraid of? Why did we need to keep busy? You know, you can't be seen not doing anything. Something is wrong.
Yeah.
And yes, we can obviously trace it back to slavery, but I think another big thing that we need to take into consideration, and especially here in the Western Cape, if we look at how men were or are emasculated within the work environment, and if we take this strip here, the Salt River strip, and all the factories that were there, that's all gone now. First, they let the men go when they got all these machines in to do the work.
Yeah.
Right? So all the men were now back in the communities. Then all the women were let go. Now there's no one. So now we have the men at home and we have the women at home. And the women, what happens to the man at that point is that obviously he doesn't have a job, he's unemployed, he can't provide for his family. We love these things every day, we see these things every day. Where does he have power? In the home. If he's still at home, because half of them are not at home anymore. But I mean, if he's at home, where does he have power? He has power in the house, and this is where he now displays his power. And so if the food is not on time, whether you help to get that food there or not, it will be a scene. You know, if his water is not there, or if anything in the house is not right, he's the one that will exert his power over the woman. And so she's always on this, you know, this must be done and that must be done and the food must be ready and the kids must be sorted out and all of those kinds of things. And so there's that, there's the slavery and what that did and all of that that's passed down. There's colonialism and what that did. In all of that, there's emasculation. All of those feelings, angers, triggers, sits in this man that's sitting in the community, my next door neighbor.
Yes.
It sits in him. And so how does that, and then he's this angry person in his home, and this is what his kids see. And so there's no resistance to that, obviously, until you see other things. But also we're taught to be silent. And so there's no conversation about it. And so it gets accepted as normal behavior. So I think there's a lot of influence. The influence is not, I mean, nobody is born and then with, you're not taught to, you're not born a perpetrator.
No, exactly. And even not born with, because you're making me think even just hierarchy, that
Yes.
hierarchy and the fact that power must sit with someone, and
Yes.
the fact that we taught that, hierarchy, patriarchy, or
Yes.
colonialism, and what all of that has
Yeah.
in common is that somebody is sitting with the power and needs to exert that power over someone. We have to take another short break,
Okay.
but we'll be back with more after this. Welcome back. You are still watching Mental Health Matters, and we are still here with Judith Kennedy from Inside Out. We've been speaking about trauma and intergenerational trauma. And Judy, before the break, we were interrogating sort of our responses and our triggers, and how sometimes we can be triggered by something that is not, didn't directly happen to us. Like, where did it come from? And how something in our family's history or within our ancestors can actually sort of derive some of our responses. I wanted to ask just, as we close off the show and we want to think about how can people use this information, how can the viewers at home take some of what we've spoken about here and incorporate it into their own lives, I wanted to ask, so how can we look at our history and use our history to help us deal with our trauma today?
I think that's it's a very important question, and I think when we talk about intergenerational trauma first, we must realize it is about our history. So if we want to heal in our generations, we need to go back and look at what are the things that happened in our own histories. So what happened to my mother? What happened to my grandmother? What happened to her parents? And we might not find all the answers, but the answers that we do find can help us to understand ourselves better so that we are able to make better decisions as we go forward. Also, just in terms of collective trauma and history, I mean, we can go on and talk about this thing, but how do we deal, if we look at South Africa and we look at all the kind of trauma that as South African citizens we've gone through, how do we start healing those things? So there's this thing, someone coined the term trauma denied, and made the example of the TRC, where people came and told their stories, but the kind of support that was given afterwards to deal with the trauma wasn't necessarily enough. Also, every year we celebrate the lives of fallen comrades, we celebrate the lives of all of these people with the families and the friends of those people. And every year that trauma gets rehashed. And every year we make a big thing about, because yes, we have to celebrate the lives and we have to celebrate the fact that they've sacrificed such a lot for us to be where we are today. But what happens to those families who hasn't had the necessary support in terms of healing? And so when we talk about healing, we can't talk about healing in the absence of talking about our history and working through those things. Because if we don't do that, and if we think it's 1 and 2 and 3 sessions is going to heal us, then we have a problem. Because it takes years. I mean, if one event happens now, it takes many, many years to grapple with and to work through that process. Healing is also never, I mean, I haven't seen a healed person.
Yes, it's a journey.
It's a journey, and it's a
Yes.
lifelong journey, and it's a journey that we need to be conscious of all the time. And by being, we need to be conscious of ourselves continuously and all the time. We need to be conscious of what we think. We need to be conscious of what we say to ourselves, and how we speak to ourselves, and before we conscious of how we speak to other people and what we say to other people. I think it's about, like for us as Inside Out, everything starts with the self, and so it is about being conscious of what you say to yourself, and how you behave, and be aware of your own behaviors and your own triggers. I think to viewers out there, in terms of what they can do, are those things, is acknowledge, even if you don't verbalize it yet, but acknowledge that this thing happened, or that you are traumatized. Start writing, start walking, start doing something that is out of what you normally do.
Yeah.
Start breaking the patterns, you know, start, go to the mountain and go to the beach or wherever, go scream, go shout, go get the physical release from your body. And start doing those things. Writing is a good way to also document your healing and to get it out there. And come to the healing circles when we start next year.
I really like that, and I like sort of using, you know, if you can't get yourself to a space, or you mentally or emotionally, to like specifically identify a pattern to break, to use it to, you know, create a physical change. You know, break a physical pattern. Go walk if you've always sat on the couch, and just the doing of that is going to disrupt something enough for you to shift forward. We have 2 minutes, but I do also want to ask you. I saw something on Facebook the other day. And it said, you know, yes, we talk about inherited trauma, but we also inherited good things. And that's the other side.
Wisdom.
Intergenerational
because
wisdom.
we just talk about trauma. So, I mean, it's the new buzz. Everyone is now doing all of this work.
Yeah.
But we very seldomly talk about intergenerational wealth and intergenerational wisdom and the gifts that we've received from our ancestors. I mean, we have young people who can pick up an instrument and just play with. They can't read, they've never, but they can play. Where do they get that from? You know, and so we need to celebrate those things, but we also need to bring the wisdom and the gifts to the fore.
Yeah.
Because we are not just traumatized, we are also very blessed.
Yeah.
By and from our ancestors, and so that we need to keep a balance, because this journey can be very, it can send you into spirals.
Yes.
And so if we don't recognize the kind of talents and gifts and wisdom and knowledge that we've received from our ancestors also, not everything was bad.
I love that.
Like,
I love it. I
everything
think it's
was bad.
no, exactly. And I think that is a perfect note to sort of end on, because we've also, I mean, we've had like a long conversation that focused on trauma and like 2 minutes on wealth and wisdom. And so when we dig into this very difficult and very traumatic itself, you know, issues that we've been through, I think it's important for us to remember also that we are here, and that we are here through resilience and wealth and wisdom. So, Judy, I want to say thank you so much for coming on and sharing with us.
Thank you very much for having us.
And that brings us to the end of our show for today. Thank you for joining us. I'm Lenina Rassool. Goodbye.